What if I told you that your warmest down jacket and best hiking boots wouldn't help you survive even a few hours in the harsh winter conditions of the Great Plains? We are accustomed to thinking of cold as an inconvenience that can be easily remedied by pressing a button on the thermostat or buying another high-tech jacket. We are convinced that modern technology makes us invulnerable and that survival in the past was primitive and simple. We will look not only at the tribes of the Great Plains, such as the Lakota and Cheyenne, but also take a peek into the longhouses of the Iroquois and the harsh camps of the subarctic peoples. Step by step, we will analyze why the skills that seem basic to us were actually the pinnacle of engineering and scientific thought of their time. It will be a journey into a world where survival was a daily art. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn why modern man would fail not because of a lack of equipment, but because of a loss of fundamental knowledge, and what one seemingly simple task would prove absolutely impossible for him. What if I told you that everything you believed about winter clothing is not true? We spend hundreds of dollars on jackets with membranes, insulation, and clever technologies, believing that they are the ultimate protection against the cold. But all this high-tech armor is designed for short trips from the car to the office or for active sports, where the body itself generates excess heat. It is completely unsuitable for spending many hours, and sometimes many days, in the biting wind of the Great Plains at -30 degrees. The problem with modern clothing is its inability to adapt. It is either too warm or does not provide sufficient protection from the wind. Indigenous peoples approach this issue like engineers, creating multi-layered systems that could be adjusted. The basis of their protection was not the warmth of a single item, but the synergy of several layers, each of which performed its own function. And the main enemy they defeated was not the cold, but their own sweat. A modern person wearing a down jacket would start sweating at the first sign of physical exertion, such as chopping wood. An instantly damp back would be a death sentence as soon as they stopped to rest. The membranes would not be able to cope with such an amount of moisture, and the icy compress on the back would quickly take away all the heat. The clothing of indigenous peoples was breathable, not because of a marketing brochure, but because of its very nature. Take, for example, the peoples of the subarctic, such as the Cree or the Athabascans. Their clothing was a true marvel of thermoregulation. They wore fur not on the outside, but on the inside against the body, which provided maximum heat retention. The outer layer of skillfully tanned leather, often without wool, protected against wind and snow, but remained porous, allowing moisture to evaporate. It was a delicate balance honed over millennia. Plains dwellers, such as the Lakota, used a different approach based on bison hides. A winter parka made of bison hide, sewn with the fur on the inside, was incredibly warm, but the key element was its design. It was roomy, with wide sleeves and a wide hem, which allowed not only for ventilation by simply raising the arms, but also for use as a sleeping bag by tucking the knees up. Footwear was another unsolvable problem for modern man. Our boots with thick rubber soles are insulators, but they are also steam baths for the feet. At first glance, the moccasins of the Plains people seem ridiculously thin, but the secret was not in them, but in what was inside. The moccasin was just an outer shell, and inside it was stuffed with dry grass, moss, or felt insoles made of rabbit fur. This filling was not only insulation, but also an absorbent. It was changed several times a day, always carrying a supply of dry grass. It was an active process of moisture management that modern people would not even think about until their feet in waterproof shoes turned into numb blocks. They would simply not realize that the warmth of their feet needs to be constantly maintained. Hands are another point of failure. Our gloves separate the fingers, condemning each of them to freeze individually. Indigenous peoples used mittens, where the fingers kept each other warm. These mittens were also multi-layered, often with an outer layer of waterproof leather and an inner layer of warm fur. Their design allowed the mittens to be quickly removed without losing them for performing small tasks. Modern man would fail in the first few hours because he perceives clothing as passive protection. He would put on all his warmest clothes and expect to be comfortable. For the indigenous people, Clothing was an active tool that required constant attention, adjustment, and maintenance. They wore not just skins, but a complex climate control system. Thus, the first night in a winter camp would be a shock to a modern person. They would either freeze from their own passivity or get wet from their own activity. They would not understand that their clothing is not armor, but a living organism that needs to be cared for. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think is the most useless element of modern clothing in such conditions? Write about it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about the most famous Native American dwelling? Thanks to countless films, the teepee has become a symbol of life on the Great Plains. In our minds, it is a cozy, warm, and safe refuge where Native Americans sought shelter from the winter cold. But this romantic image has nothing to do with reality. The winter teepee was not a fortress against the cold, but a complex engineering device that required constant maintenance. A modern person entering a teepee on a frosty day would be shocked. They would expect a warm room, like in a log cabin, but would find that it was only slightly warmer inside than outside. The strength of the teepee was not in its insulation, but in its ingenious ventilation system and ability to safely contain an open fire. It was in essence a very complex windbreak for a fire. The design, which seems simple, was actually the pinnacle of aerodynamics. The teepee was always placed with its entrance facing east, and its slightly asymmetrical, egg-shaped base and backward-sloping cone gave it incredible resistance to the hurricane-force winds of the plains. The frame, made of 12 to 15 long lodgepole pine poles, was both strong and flexible. The secret to its comfort, however, lay not in the poles or the outer covering of sewn bison hides. The key element was the inner lining, known to the Lakota as the ozone. It was a strip of leather or fabric that was attached to the poles at a height of 1.5 to 2 meters and hung down to the floor. This seemingly simple detail completely changed the physics inside the dwelling. The ozone created what we would today call a double convection system. The cold air that inevitably penetrated under the lower edge of the outer covering did not blow on people, but entered the space between the covering and the ozone. There it was heated by the fire, rose upward, and, mixing with the smoke, was drawn out through the smoke hole. This created a constant draft, preventing smoke from accumulating. For a modern person, controlling this flow would be an impossible task. At the top of the teepee were 2 smoke valves, or ears, each controlled by a separate pole. They had to be constantly adjusted depending on the strength and direction of the wind. If the valves were set incorrectly, the entire dwelling would instantly fill with acrid smoke. This work required experience, attention, and constant presence. It was not like turning on an extractor fan in the kitchen. A person had to read the wind by its sound, by the vibrations of the roof, by the behavior of the fire. A modern person accustomed to passive systems would simply not understand what was required of them and would spend the night either in smoke or in the cold. The fire itself was also not what we imagine it to be. It was not a large roaring fireplace, but a very small, compact, and incredibly efficient fire in a central hearth. It did not require large logs, but dry, finely chopped branches. Maintaining such a fire is also an art that requires constant, but not excessive attention. The floor in the teepee was not dirty. It was covered with skins, fur side up, creating a warm and soft surface. The sleeping places were located at the edges, where it was cooler, but there was no smoke. People slept covered with thick bison skins, which served as both mattresses and blankets. Thus, the teepee was not a warm home in our understanding. The temperature at floor level could be close to that outside, while it was hot under the ceiling. It was a space with clear zoning, where every centimeter of height had its own microclimate. Surviving in it meant not just being there, but actively managing it. But was the teepee the only solution? Were there other dwellings that solved the problem of cold in a different way? Of course, and some of them were much more substantial. In the next chapter, we will explore a structure that was more like a modern apartment building than a tent, and learn how hundreds of people lived under one roof in the forests of the Northeast. I will reveal the best-kept secret of the Iroquois' survival, and it is not weapons or hunting, but architecture. If the teepee on the plains was a marvel of mobility and aerodynamics, The Longhouse of the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, peoples of the Northeast was a monumental achievement in communal housing and thermodynamics. It was not just a building, but a living social organism where physical warmth was inseparable from social warmth. Modern people, accustomed to personal space and privacy, would be psychologically broken in a longhouse before they even began to freeze. These massive structures, sometimes reaching 100 meters in length, were home not to a single family, but to an entire clan, accommodating up to 20 families or hundreds of people. There were no walls separating one family from another, only a central passageway with rows of hearths. The construction of the house was ingenious. The frame, made of sturdy poles dug into the ground, curved and connected at the top, forming a vaulted roof. On the outside, this frame was covered with large sheets of elm bark, which were removed in the spring when they were full of sap. As the bark dried, it became as hard as a board and waterproof. The layers of bark overlapped like tiles, creating surprisingly effective protection from wind and precipitation. Inside, the space was clearly organized. Along the walls were two-tiered bunks. The lower tier served as both a bed and a bench, while the upper tier was used for storage and sometimes as an additional sleeping place. All personal belongings, dried corn supplies, tobacco bundles, and animal skins were stored here under the roof. It was a world where all of life, from birth to death, took place in full view of everyone. Heating was centralized. A passageway ran along the entire length of the house, and every 6 or 7 meters, there was a common hearth shared by two families living opposite each other. The heat from these numerous fires rose upward, and although there were smoke vents in the roof, the house was inevitably filled with smoke. This smoke, although unpleasant to the eyes, served an important function. It preserved food supplies hung from the beams and repelled insects. For a modern person, such a level of smoke would be unbearable. They would spend the night coughing and choking. The inhabitants of the longhouse were adapted to this from birth. They knew that the cleanest air was at the bottom, near the floor, so they slept on the lower bunks, covering themselves with skins while the smoke accumulated under the ceiling. But the main source of heat was not even the fires. The main source of heat was the people themselves. 100 people living in one enclosed, albeit huge space, generated an enormous amount of heat. The longhouse was a living incubator, where the warmth of bodies, the warmth of fires, and the warmth of community life intertwined. The issue of personal space simply did not arise. Modern people, with their need for privacy, silence, and their own corner, would feel trapped. The constant hum of voices, crying, laughter, the smells of cooking, smoke, all this created an incredibly dense sensory environment that would be torture for us. The longhouse was not just a building, but the material embodiment of their social structure. It was warmer than a teepee, much more solid and secure. But the price for this security was the complete dissolution of the personal into the collective. It was architecture based on community, not individuality. There was no room for selfishness here. Firewood for the hearth was a shared concern, food was often prepared communally, and heat was a shared resource. Survival in a longhouse was 100% a social skill. And it is precisely in this that modern man, accustomed to closing the door behind him, would fail the test. Thus, the paradox of the longhouse was that its physical comfort was higher than that of a typical house. But the psychological cost of this comfort would be unbearable for modern people. They would not freeze to death, but they could go mad from the lack of silence. If you like how we debunk myths about ancient life and show it from an unexpected angle, please like this video. What if everything you've been taught about living in harmony with nature is outdated? We romanticize the image of the indigenous hunter who leaves his teepee and returns an hour later with prey. But the reality of winter was harsh. Winter is not a time of abundance. It is a hungry time, or as many tribes called it. Nature did not give gifts. It locked its pantries with an icy lock. For modern man, the first problem is the lack of a supermarket. But even if he were left with a full refrigerator of food, he would lose. The main problem with winter is not the lack of food as such, but the inability to preserve it without technology. Survival in the winter camp was ensured not by what was obtained in winter, but by what was prepared in summer and autumn. It was a battle not for hunting, but for logistics. The inhabitants of the plains were masters of preservation. Their main resource was the bison. Summer and fall hunting was not just about obtaining fresh meat, it was about industrial-scale preservation. The meat was cut into thin strips and dried in the sun and wind, turning it into jerky. This was a way to preserve protein for months. But the pinnacle of food technology was pemmican. This was not just dried meat, it was a perfectly balanced, high-calorie energy mix. The dried meat was ground into powder, mixed with melted bison fat in a ratio of about 1:1, and crushed wild berries such as cherries or ergo were added for flavor and vitamins. This mixture was a real miracle. It did not spoil for years, was incredibly nutritious and compact. It could be eaten dry or cooked into soup. Without pemmican, long military campaigns or survival in the harsh winter would have been impossible. Modern man simply would not have had the knowledge or skills to prepare this strategic product. The peoples of the eastern forests, such as the Iroquois, had a different strategy based on agriculture. Their survival depended on the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. The autumn harvest was the culmination of the year. Corn was dried, shelled, and stored in huge bark boxes or in special hiding pits lined with grass. Dried corn, beans, and pumpkin cut into strips formed the basis of the winter diet. It was a stable, reliable carbohydrate base, but it was not enough to just grow and harvest it. It also had to be properly stored, protected from moisture and rodents. The smoke-filled storage rooms in the Longhouse were perfect for this. Of course, hunting continued in winter, but it was incredibly difficult. The peoples of the subarctic, who had neither bison nor corn, were completely dependent on hunting. They were masters at tracking moose or caribou in deep snow using snowshoes. This type of hunting required not only endurance, but also a deep understanding of the habits of the animals. For modern man, the hunting process itself would be impossible. He cannot read tracks, cannot move silently, and does not have the skills to make and use traps and snares, which were the main means of catching small game. He would simply walk through the forest, scaring away all living creatures and wasting precious calories. Thus, the first night in camp would turn into a humiliating spectacle. Surrounded by supplies of pemmican and dried corn, modern man would not even be able to recognize them. He would look for food in its familiar, fresh form, and not finding it, would decide that everyone around him was starving, while the camp sat on its strategic reserves. Did you imagine that survival in winter actually began in summer? That the whole strategy was to outsmart time by preserving the abundance of summer? But what if all that food is there, but you can't cook it? In the next chapter, we'll learn why fire was not just a convenience, but a supreme science, and why your 100% skill at striking a lighter would be useless. We take fire for granted. It appears with the click of a lighter, the turn of a knob on the stove, or a single match. We are so accustomed to instant fire that we have completely forgotten what it really is. A complex chemical process that requires three conditions: fuel, oxygen, and temperature. And it is in the winter forest that modern man would discover that he cannot provide any of them. The first setback would occur at the stage of obtaining a spark. Of course, they could try friction, for example, with a hand drill or bow drill. But what is easily demonstrated on survival shows requires superhuman endurance in reality, and more importantly, perfectly dry materials. A board and spindle made of raw, frozen wood will yield nothing but calluses and despair. Indigenous peoples rarely made fire from scratch. It was too labor-intensive. Much more important was the ability to preserve and transport fire. There was always a fire pit on duty in the camp, which was maintained around the clock. When setting out on a journey, women often carried smoldering coals in special containers made of tinder fungus or clay. This was much more efficient than starting from scratch every time. An older and more reliable method than friction is striking sparks, but not with flint on steel, which was not available, but with flint on pyrite or marcasite. This method requires special skill and, most importantly, the right tinder. And here we come to the main secret: the tinder fungus. Tinder fungi, such as chaga, were specially processed, boiled, and dried, turning into a material capable of catching and holding the slightest spark. Without such a prepared receiver, all attempts by modern man would be in vain. He would not know what to look for, how to process it, or how to store it. But let's say he miraculously managed to get a smoldering ember in his tinder. Now he needs kindling. And here, his second fiasco awaits him. In the winter forest, everything is covered with snow and ice. Modern man would start gathering branches from the ground, not realizing that they are thoroughly saturated with moisture. He would try to set fire to the bark, which would be just as wet. The indigenous people knew the golden rule: dry wood in winter is not found on the ground, but on trees. They looked for dead but still standing trees, especially pines or spruces, whose lower branches had died but remained dry under the protection of the crown. They knew that the best kindling material was resinous chips that could be shaved from the heartwood of a dry pine stump or paper-thin birch bark. Birch bark burns even when wet due to its high oil content, but even it had to be found and properly prepared. But the main problem was not kindling, but fuel. Tipis, or longhouses, required enormous amounts of firewood. It was continuous, daily, and incredibly hard work. Indigenous peoples did not have modern saws. Before the advent of metal axes, they used stone axes, which were ineffective for cutting living trees. They were masters at gathering dead wood. Even with the advent of metal axes obtained through trade, gathering firewood remained hard work. The wood had to be not only felled, but also cut up, brought to the camp, and chopped. This was mainly done by women. A modern person, unaccustomed to physical labor, would be exhausted after the first hour of such work. They would not be able to calculate the consumption. They would burn all their firewood in a couple of hours, trying to build a large, warming fire, not understanding that a small and efficient one is needed. They would not know that different types of wood burn differently. Some give off heat, others give off long-lasting embers, and still others give off a lot of smoke. Thus, a modern person, finding himself alone in a winter forest, would not be able to light a fire. And even if he did, he would not be able to maintain it. He would freeze next to a pile of perfect but wet fuel, not knowing how to turn it into heat. He would fail the basic physics and chemistry exam that indigenous peoples took every day. Guess what was the most labor-intensive task in winter camp? It wasn't hunting or building shelters, but simply quenching thirst. We live in a world where water is available at the turn of a tap, but we have forgotten its true physical state in the winter world. In the world of indigenous peoples, all water was solid. It was locked up in rivers, lakes, and in the snow itself. The first and most dangerous instinct of modern man is to eat snow. Feeling thirsty, he would start shoveling snow into his mouth, thinking that he was solving the problem. In fact, he would be signing his own death warrant. To turn snow into water inside the body expends a huge amount of precious energy. This process does not quench thirst, but catastrophically lowers the body temperature from within, accelerating hypothermia. Indigenous peoples knew this rule. Snow can only be eaten in extreme cases, and even then only in small amounts. All the water needed for drinking and cooking had to be melted, and for this, fire was needed, which, as we have already established, was extremely valuable in itself and required constant labor. Obtaining water was directly linked to obtaining fuel. The process was painfully slow. On the plains, women would walk to the nearest river, which was frozen to a depth of a meter or more. They had to break through the ice using heavy sticks or axes, if they had them. It was hard and dangerous work. Then they would scoop the icy water into skins or animal stomachs and carry it back to camp. In the forested areas of the Northeast, before the advent of metal utensils, the process was even more difficult. The Iroquois used clay pots, but they were fragile and could crack in the cold. More commonly used were containers made of bark, such as birch. But in such a container, it was impossible to boil water over an open fire. It would burn. This is where the hot stones technique came into play. Women boiled water not by placing the pot on the fire, but by bringing the fire to the pot. Smooth stones were heated red hot in a large fire. Then, using special wooden tongs, they were lowered one by one into a container of water or snow. The stone hissed as it gave off its heat and was replaced by the next hot one. It was a long process that required constant attention. It was necessary to maintain a large fire for the stones, constantly carry the stones back and forth, and make sure that the bark container did not burn through. It could take hours to obtain a few liters of drinking water or broth. It was work that continued from morning to night. For a modern person, the scale of this labor would be unimaginable. They would not understand why it takes half a day just to drink tea. They are used to instant results. They would quickly become frustrated by the inefficiency of this process, not understanding that this is the only way possible. Thirst was a constant companion in the winter camp. The dry, frosty air dehydrated the body no less than the desert heat, but the body did not send such clear signals. It was necessary to force oneself to drink, and for this it was necessary to work constantly to obtain this water. A modern person would most likely simply give up, falling into apathy from exhaustion. Have you ever thought about how much energy you expend on a simple glass of water? For indigenous peoples, water was not a resource, but a product of hard labor. But even with fire, food, and water, modern man would face an invisible but much more dangerous enemy. In the next chapter, we will talk about the psychology of cold and why silence and darkness can break you faster than hunger. We fear darkness on an instinctive level, but in reality, we are never in true darkness. Our civilization is a civilization of artificial light. Streetlights, phone screens, car headlights, lamps in homes. We live in a world of perpetual twilight, where night never truly falls. We have completely lost our adaptation to the primitive, all-consuming darkness. A winter night in the prairies or subarctic forests is not just an absence of light. It is a state that lasts 14, 16, or even 18 hours a day. For modern man, accustomed to the day ending at his will, rather than according to the laws of astronomy, this would be the first psychological blow. He would find himself trapped in time, where minutes drag on like hours. The only source of light in a teepee or longhouse was a small, smoldering fire. It gave off not light, but rather shadows. It illuminated only a small circle in the center, leaving the corners and sleeping people in impenetrable darkness. This play of shadows, constant movement, and crackling created a lively but frightening atmosphere for the unprepared. But darkness was not a time of inactivity. Quite the contrary. It was a time when camp life took a different turn. When sight became useless, other senses sharpened. It was a time for work that did not require light, for work by touch. Men repaired harnesses, checked bowstrings, and carved arrowheads. Women sewed and mended clothes and softened hides. For modern people, this would be impossible. Our hands are not trained to see. We cannot perform a simple task without lighting it up. Plunged into darkness, our man would feel helpless and useless. He would just sit there, waiting for dawn, while invisible work was going on around him. An even greater challenge would be the silence, or rather, the lack of it. Our world is filled with monotonous hums, the noise of the refrigerator, the hum of computers, street traffic. This is the white noise we are accustomed to. A winter night in the camp is filled with completely different sounds. It is the crackling of frozen trees, the howling of the wind, which sounds different when it hits the skins of a teepee or the bark of a longhouse. These are sounds that carry information. An experienced resident could predict a change in the weather by the sound of the wind. He could hear the snow crunching under the paws of a predator or the hooves of a moose. For a modern person, these would be simply frightening, inexplicable noises. He would shudder at every crack, his imagination painting a picture of 1,000 dangers. But the main challenge would be the lack of privacy. In a longhouse, hundreds of people slept, ate, worked, and lived in the same space. In a teepee, a family of 5 to 7 people huddled together in a few square meters. There was no concept of personal time or personal space. You were always on display, always part of the collective. A modern person, with their cult of individualism and need for privacy, would feel trapped. The constant smells, the sounds of other people's breathing, coughing, and talking would create incredible psychological pressure. They would not be able to recharge their batteries by locking themselves in their room. Thus, the very first night would be torture for a modern person. Not physical, but mental. The darkness would rob them of their sight, the sounds would fill them with fear, and the lack of privacy would break their will. They would not be able to cope with the cold, but with sensory deprivation and, at the same time, sensory overload. Our survival in the modern world is automated. We spend most of our energy earning money, which we then exchange for comforts created by the labor of others. Pressing a button gives us heat, turning on a tap gives us water, going to the store gives us food. We are completely separated from the physical reality of providing for our own lives. And it is precisely this reality that would have fallen upon us in the winter camp. Modern man imagines survival as a series of heroic deeds, starting a fire by friction, building a shelter, hunting an animal. But the reality of survival is not heroism, but an endless, monotonous, and exhausting routine. It is not a sprint, but a marathon consisting of thousands of small but vital tasks. And it is this routine that would break him. A day in the winter camp began before dawn in a frozen dwelling. The first task was not to eat breakfast, but to stoke the coals of yesterday's fire. If the coals had gone out, the long process of obtaining fire began. This was the first battle of the day, and everything else depended on it. Then the battle for water began. Hours of hard work melting snow or chopping ice. While the women were busy with fire and water, the men checked their equipment. In winter conditions, any breakdown was critical. A cracked snowshoe frame, a weakened bowstring, a broken tip, all of this required immediate repair. There were no stores for spare parts. Everything had to be done by hand, from materials at hand, in the freezing cold. Then began the endless quest for fuel. Wood was life, but it did not lie in neat piles. You had to go out and look for it, often for miles, find dead wood, chop it, drag it through deep snow, and then chop it up. This work never stopped. The camp consumed a huge amount of firewood every day. A modern person, accustomed to comfortable office work, would be physically destroyed by this workload. Their muscles, unaccustomed to this type of labor, would give out after a couple of hours. They would not understand why, having barely finished one task, they would immediately have to start another, just as difficult one. They would have no time for rest, as we understand it. Clothing maintenance was another constant task. Moccasins had to be dried every evening, but not by the fire, where the leather would shrink, but by the warmth of one's own body. Any hole in clothing was immediately sewn up. Needles were made from bone and thread from animal tendons. It was painstaking work that required enormous patience. Cooking was also a laborious process. If it was pemmican, it had to be crushed. If it was dried corn, it had to be cooked for a long time to make it edible. It was not like throwing a semi-finished product into the microwave. Modern man would not be able to withstand this rhythm. He would consider this life an unbearable routine, a meaningless series of hard work. He would not see the higher purpose in it, because for him, the goal is comfort and free time. For indigenous peoples, the goal was life itself, and this routine was its price and its essence. They would simply sit down in despair, unable to force themselves to drag another armful of firewood. We look at a winter landscape and see a white spot. For us, snow is just snow. It can be fluffy, wet, or icy. That's usually where our knowledge ends. We look at nature, but we do not see it. We have lost the ability to read the complex language in which the universe writes about itself at every moment in time. For a native of the plains or subarctic forests, snow was an open book full of information. He didn't just see snow, he saw dozens of varieties, each with its own name and meaning. There was snow that was easy to walk on with snowshoes, and snow that you got stuck in. There was snow that held tracks well, and snow that immediately covered them up. Leaving his teepee in the morning, the hunter could read everything that had happened during the night in the snow. Here a deer had passed, and from the depth of the tracks and the distance between them, he could determine its size, speed, and even whether it was wounded or healthy. Here a mouse had crawled, and over there were the wing marks of the owl that had caught it. For him, it was not just a beautiful picture, but a morning report of events. A modern person in this forest would be completely blind and deaf. They would see nothing but a beautiful winter landscape. They would not be able to distinguish the tracks of a moose from those of a deer. They would not understand that the light snow drifting in from the north meant a sudden and sharp cold snap. They would not notice that the birds had fallen silent, which is a sure sign of an approaching storm. Knowing animal habits was not just a hobby, but the key to survival. The hunter knew that in severe frost, deer would seek shelter in dense spruce forests. He knew where caribou would cross the frozen river. He knew at what time of day partridges would come out to feed. All this was not innate intuition, but a vast amount of knowledge accumulated over generations. This applied not only to fauna, but also to flora. A modern person, looking at a bare winter forest, would see only firewood. The indigenous people saw a pharmacy and a pantry. They knew that under the snow they could find calamus roots, which help with coughs. They knew that the bark of young pine trees is edible and rich in vitamins. They knew which type of fungus to collect for a fire starter and which to use to stop bleeding. Even orientation in space would be a problem. Without a compass and a navigator, a modern person would be disoriented in 10 minutes. The native used the sun, the stars, the prevailing wind direction, and the side of the trees covered with moss to find his way. He had a map in his head, and it was much more accurate than any paper map. This ecological literacy, this deep connection with the world, was the main force, and it was its absence that made modern man completely helpless. He would have died of hunger in the middle of a forest full of food and frozen to death surrounded by fuel. He would not have understood any of the thousands of warnings and clues that nature gave him every second. We have come to the main paradox. Why would modern man, the product of the most developed and technologically advanced civilization, be so pathetic in conditions that indigenous peoples considered simply life? The answer is simple. Our strength has become our main weakness. Our civilization is built on narrow specialization, while theirs was built on versatility. Modern man is a specialist. He may be a brilliant programmer, a brilliant financier, or a talented doctor, but they are completely helpless outside their narrow field. They do not know how to obtain food, build housing, sew clothes, or make tools. They have delegated all these skills to the system, to farmers, builders, factories, and engineers. In the winter camp of indigenous peoples, every adult was a jack of all trades. A man was not only a hunter, but also a gunsmith, strategist, tracker, and carpenter. He could make a bow, make snowshoes, build a teepee frame, and read the stars. He was an engineer who carried all his blueprints and tools in his head and hands. Women were no less versatile. She was a chemical engineer who tanned hides. She was a logistics engineer responsible for Pemmican supplies. She was an architect responsible for setting up and maintaining the teepee. She was a doctor who knew the properties of hundreds of herbs. She was a textile worker who turned tendons and skin into perfect clothing. The first night in camp would be fatal for a modern person, not because of the cold, but because of overload. He would face a dozen vital tasks that had to be solved simultaneously. He would have had to maintain the fire, boil water, repair clothing, monitor ventilation in the teepee, and prepare food. He would not have been able to cope with this flood of tasks because he did not know how to do any of them. He would have made a cascade of fatal mistakes. He would have gotten wet trying to chop wood. He would have been poisoned by smoke if he had set the teepee vents incorrectly. He would have eaten snow and accelerated his hypothermia. He would not have noticed when his shoes cracked and would have been left barefoot. Each of these little things would have been a death sentence. The title of this video is not an insult. The statement that we would not have survived is not a statement of our pampered nature. It is the greatest compliment to the incredible level of knowledge, skill, resilience, and engineering thought possessed by the indigenous peoples of America. They did not survive in our understanding of the word. They lived. They lived in a world that required a person to be whole, not partial. They had systemic thinking, while we have clip thinking. They saw the world as a whole, where everything is connected to everything else, while we see it as a set of unrelated apps on a smartphone. Their legacy is not just museum exhibits. It is a reminder of what a person can be when they are in full contact with reality. They were true masters of life, and compared to them, we are mere amateurs, protected from the consequences of our ignorance by a thin wall of technology. We have walked through snow-covered plains and smoky longhouses, trying to understand why it would be so difficult for modern humans to live in the world of Native Americans. We saw that it was not a matter of frost resistance or physical strength, but of lost knowledge. Survival in those conditions was not a struggle, but a science, an art, and a philosophy that we traded for comfort and automation. We hope this journey has made you look at not only history in a new light, but also your own thermostat, water tap, and supermarket shelves. These are not givens, but the result of a complex system that hides from us the true cost of warmth and fullness. What other aspects of the lives of indigenous peoples or other ancient cultures would you like to explore in detail? Perhaps you are interested in their social structure, military tactics, or spiritual practices. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And of course, Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next explorations of the hidden pages of history.